The last lecture, we ended up discussing the socialist Zionism, and so I want to resume our discussion from that point onward. You may recall that I mentioned that once the socialists decided to go and build their commune or kibbutz in Israel, they went about this very methodically with excellent planning. I mentioned that they had developed a blueprint for a new society which had a lot of details into it, and the kibbutz became the major way in which this new society was to be implemented. Now, the socialist Zionists were really elite group among the Jews, and they viewed themselves pretty much that way as elites. They believed that all Jews, because of historical circumstances, are really bourgeois and not a differentiated social group. So you would have to start the new nation, according to their thinking, from scratch with elites who believe in socialist ideology. You can't contaminate, so to speak, that nascent society with bourgeoisie thinking. So this means you're going to leave the bourgeoisie Jews back in Europe. And so they made their appeal only, the socialists made their appeal only to selected groups of elites, of Jewish elites, inviting them to join them in their start of a new society. So by 1920s, the socialists become the strongest and the best organized factions among the Zionists who were in Israel. And because of their strength, they end up taking over the control of the Zionist organization, and therefore they are really the rulers in that era. The political leaders of the socialist Zionists are the first Prime Minister of Israel, Ben-Gurion, Levi Eshkol, and Golda Meir. These are really the big figures in that period. And you will see that by 1930s, there emerges a reaction to this socialist takeover of Zionist organization. Those who are reacting, they're known as the revisionists. So the revisionists have a backlash to the dominance of the socialists. The point that is being emphasized by the revisionists is that they're challenging the idea of building an exclusively socialist society in Palestine. What the revisionists want is to bring all Jews, not just those by invitation, but bring all Jews to Palestine and not just the elites. For them, the biblical border, and that's another big point of difference, for them, the biblical borders, for revisionists, the biblical borders of Israel was of utmost importance. So their image of this new land is the greater or Eretz Israel. The revisionists, you will see, will evolve into what I call Messianic Zionism. That is, these are people who later on, including today, are people who are completely bent up absorbing entire West Bank as part of Israel. They regard the West Bank as Samaria and Judea. So these are the people that are the toughest one as far as negotiation with Palestinians would be concerned. They are unwilling to give back anything, and they want to have that whole area for themselves. The revisionist leaders include one Jabotinsky and Zev Jabotinsky and his successor was another prime minister of Israel back in 1977 by the name of Menachem Begin. Now, going back to 1930s, the socialists were the dominant group, and despite the revisionist backlash, it did not really undermine their dominance, the socialist dominance. And they have put in place most of the institutions that you would need to create a viable state. These include Histadrut, which if you translate it to a labor organization, it's really a misnaming of it, because it is much more than a labor organization. It is really almost a mini state, so to speak. They had the banks, they had the educational system, and of course they had the kibbutzim. Now, beginning in 1930s, you will see that Nazism and fascism are on the rise in Europe. The socialists begin to realize that the Jews who are left in Europe are in serious trouble. So, as the Jews of Europe begin to flee the continent, some go to the United States and Europe, parts of Europe, I should say, but others go to Palestine. So from 1930 until 1946, we get a mass of non-Zionist bourgeoisie, Jews from Europe, who are coming to Palestine. So this is no longer that elite socialist, you're getting common Jews coming to Palestine. The historical forces at the time really end up compelling socialists to accept the mass migration of the Jews and kind of disrupt their plan for a kind of a utopian socialist state. And the socialists rely on the institutions that they had put in place in Palestine and these institutions were under their control, to be able to absorb this influx of European Jews. Many of the new immigrants quickly joined one of the socialist parties, and these parties guarantee them jobs, and they are very important in getting education for their children, as well as providing them with other benefits. So in effect, the socialist parties and Histadrut, the big mini state that I mentioned, were ready and prepared to absorb the migrating Jewish masses. And in the process, they did their very best to co-opt the new immigrants politically. This success of the socialists to large extent explain why for over 30 years, or more precisely from 1947 until 1977, the Labor Party was able to rule Israel. Now, going back to the three groups that I had mentioned, the religious Orthodox, the assimilationist or political Zionist, and the socialist Zionist, the question now is, how would each of these groups justify the existence of Israel as a Jewish state in the heart of Arab Palestine? For the Orthodox or religious Zionists, the answer is simply this. They give a religious explanation, religious justification. Bible explained it. God gave them the promised land. So for them, the answer is in the Bible. For the assimilationist or political Zionism, they tend to give legalistic justification for the creation or establishment of State of Israel. They would argue that the Balfour Declaration was one of those legal documents that was given by the British, and the second one was a UN resolution that called for the partition of Palestine and creation of Israel. As for the Palestinian, what would the so-called political Zionists or the former assimilationists would say? The answer is that they should go to Jordan. Jordan is Palestine. Finally, what about the socialist Zionist? For them, they really have a moral dilemma trying to explain the establishment of State of Israel. The real problem for them is that they realized very quickly that Palestine was not, quote, a land without a people. Before coming to Palestine, socialists were basically unaware of the Palestinians or the native population. When they arrived in Palestine, they had a difficult time. Arab Palestinians began to resist their presence. And remember now, for the socialist, in an idealistic sense, in a socialist state, being an Arab or a Jew should not make a difference. They're all proletariat. However, when social Zionists were confronted with Arab nationalism and Arab resistance, they countered by defend yourself response. So there has been a lot of guilt feeling, a lot of confusion and ambivalence among the socialist Zionists, some of which persist among them to this day. For them, the nature and the character of Israeli polity is defined by the socialist worldview and the socialist ideology. Many of them, therefore, favor a separate Palestinian state. But for many of them, they believe this is not so much because the Palestinians truly deserve such a state, but because they believe if you keep Palestinian as a second-class Israeli citizens, you will pay a very steep price in terms of corrupting your own society. Note that there is a kind of a smugness or smug quality in their attitudes. These are the socialists that I'm talking about, toward the Palestinian. And this smugness is probably best exemplified by the following comment made by Golda Meir, one of the leaders of socialist Zionists and Israel's prime minister in the early 1970s, the comments that he made to the visiting President Sadat of Egypt. She said, quote, "We can forgive you for killing our children, but we cannot forgive you for making us kill your children." Notice the self-righteous and the holier-than-thou attitude that imbues this quote. So they have had this issue of feeling superior morally to almost anyone else. As for political Zionists, I should just add that they are really not concerned so much about democracy for non-Jews in Israel. Ideology for them is secondary. The primary issue for them is to ensure that Israel remains a Jewish society, a Jewish state, and to maintain the physical integrity of the land that is defined by Bible, especially if you are of religious variety. In other words, maintaining the Eretz or Greater Israel. In that sense, the political Zionists have or experience less difficulty living with Arabs under their occupation than is the case with the socialists.